Hello class, today we're looking at a chapter from our ethics book by McKinnon and Fiala on feminism and the ethics of care. So when we use the term feminist ethics, we're highlighting a position whereby we're concerned with the well-being of women and girls, and also positioning our ethical attitude toward a critique of their unequal treatment and the violence brought upon them. So, as McKinnon and Fiala point out, feminist philosophers often define feminism as, quote, an intellectual commitment and political movement whereby we aim for justice for women and the end of misogyny and sexism in all forms, unquote. So often feminism as an ethical theory is set as a critique of traditional approaches to ethics, which are primarily based on values such as autonomy, impartiality, and neutrality. So these values are seen by feminists as aspects of women's oppression. Thus, these values are morally problematic. Autonomy, impartiality, and neutrality are thought to be patriarchal values and obviously stressed in traditionally male-dominant ethical frameworks. So these traditional frameworks are cultural, and with this recognition, there's also a look to the downgrading of concrete caring relations. So these caring relations are obviously having to do with family life and the domestic sphere, private life, home life, personal life. So these features of everyday life are thusly viewed as a female domain, as opposed to the seemingly all-important public sphere of our lives in terms of environmental ethics and ethics in general. This recognition is of huge significance due to the fact that domestic and private life is the place where we interact with the environment and each other in intimate ways, such as with our dietary needs, which has impact on agriculture, livestock, farming, likewise purchasing clothing and caring for the house have significance in terms of consumer choices that impact clothing production and also the use of cleaners, aerosols, household chemicals, and the like. This is also to take into account that women are often placed with the responsibility of caring for the home, which is our lived environment, on top of whatever employment she has, and so forth. So let's not forget the added burden of childcare and all the ethical and environmental impacts of caring for children. That this brings about that we usually don't take into consideration. So a key developer of ethics, the ethics of feminism, was brought about by a key development in the ethics of feminism was brought about by the psychologist Carol Gilligan, who was born in 1936, so she's still alive today, who wrote a book in 1982 titled In a Different Voice, whereby she characterized the idea of women that women tend to see moral dilemmas as conflicts of responsibility, Thereby, the resolution of moral conflicts strengthen the web of relations rather than merely as a strict adherence to abstract rules and procedures. So, in other words, for Gilligan, women are apt to work with love and compassion, i.e. with more feeling and emotion, in contrast to men. Therefore, the ethics of feminism for Gilligan is then an emphasis on caring relations, right? In terms of listening to the needs and cares of others, and also thinking and acting with responsiveness, and also paying attention in terms of listening, right? With an emphasis on intuition rather than on strictly logical and rational ways in which male-based theories are usually angled. So caring is a shared experience for each other, and likewise, care for the environment is equally an emotional commitment. So in terms of caring for unjust treatment of the overlooked aspects of our lives and other people, infants, children, and the elderly. So when we look at the diagram of female ethical perspectives in contrast to male ethical perspectives, we see a binary of relations that we need to take into consideration. So on one half, we have the female ethical perspective, which is a way that the feminist is placing value on the personal, the partial, the private, the natural, the emotional aspect of our lives, and also relationships. Whereas on the male ethical perspective, we have for the traditional male-based view, we have the impersonal, the impartial, public, the emphasis on the public sphere, emphasis on autonomy and individuality. So obviously, for the feminists, as with Gilligan, there is an emphasis on relatedness, right? And relations, right? So private, personal relations are then the basis for our public relations. As a matter of fact, our personal family life is really the first place we experience moral relations in a deeply personal way. So home life is usually the grounding for all other relations, public and otherwise. So the great point to recognize about the diagram that's easily overlooked is the whole picture. That is, if in the study of philosophy and by extension ethics, we're always aiming at seeing the whole experience and the whole of our ethical sphere, right? And so we need to see that these traits are also features that anyone could value, both men and women, on both sides, right? So you have the overlooked parts, but then you have the parts that are usually emphasized in male-based ethics. But what we need to see is that both features of or both sides of the diagram are equally important, right? Which is a point that connects feminist ethics to what we're often overlooking, whether we're men, women, or even non-binary people, right? Compassion, caring, and love are emotions we're all capable of feeling, okay? These are emotions we have for each other, and likewise, we hopefully have for the environment as well, and or that we wish to foster in terms of nature, things, plants, and animals, right? So the efforts of what we term the efforts of what we term in by way of the ethics of care, we have the American philosopher Nell Noddings. She was born in 1929 and died recently in 2022. Looks like it was this summer, interestingly enough, No, it was August 25th, 2022. And so as McKinnon and Fiala indicate, Noddings emphasized the importance of caring relations, even by way of an evolutionary standpoint. A mother's care for her children is key to their survival and well-being. In terms of basic goodness, which is an obvious corollary to the natural law theory of St. Thomas Aquinas. For Noddings, we want to be cared for, and we have the ability to care. This is reciprocal, and not only should we care, the care we show should also be felt and exhibited in that which we're caring for, right? So the lack and negligence will be obvious otherwise. So such a framework initially sounds voluntary, yet we're often immersed in such relations in a reciprocal way that we often don't recognize as fundamental to our ethical growth and well-being. Here with Noddings, the ethics of care, we see a similar binary contrast as with the traditional tendency to aim for a universal, impartial standpoint with our relations in our negotiations with what's good and bad. So the impersonal commitment is something we all have a problem with, male or female. So as we usually see that to remain impartial is done within the name of a rational standpoint, right? That is also inadvertently cutting out the value of emotion in our ethical decision making, because we are so hard pressed to imagine or to have the delusion that emotions are strictly A, too subjective, or B, that emotions are too feminine, right? Never mind the emotional feeling of anger and pleasure, men don't seem to account for as emotional, right? So in other words, feeling good, anger, et cetera, are emotions that we all feel, and likewise feeling love and also pain are emotions that we all feel, male or female, non-binary. So for Noddings and the ethics of care, this is a way in which we have a means to re-examine our tradition of basing our ethical decision-making on contracts and hard rules. So to be honest, this is tough to consider even as a college professor, even as a college professor, to weigh out love and compassion in terms of the structure of my classes. So in other words, I have a way that I work out how it is that I'm working with rules and procedures with my students, but I also have to consider that emotional component that's easily forgotten about or neglected, right? And so this sometimes clashes with the emotional lives of students and likewise my own emotional life as well, right? So there's likewise some issue with the part that were already made in relation to seeing the difference between male and female. The point we've already made in relation to seeing the differences between male and female. Morality is somehow clearly defined and factual. I think that this discrepancy is good to acknowledge here with the reference that to what we've studied at the opening of the semester as the is-ought problem with David Hume. I also think that the prescriptive analysis that we simply need to care more, and by extension, to see the value of our own private lives and our own emotional lives, is at the forefront here with feminist ethics. So it's worth it as a prescription rather than seeing it as a mere fact. Right? Or even to seek to prove that men and women are, as different. So the emphasis then is less on the difference, and and more on our ethical attitudes in terms of feeling male or female. Okay, so when we're engaged in the field of feminism and ethics of care, in the context of the environment, we often hear of ecofeminism, which is clearly a conflation of the term ecology with feminism, as well as the as with the Argentine Spanish philosopher Alicia Puleo. She was born in 1952, and often this position is characterized as a critique of capitalist model of strict adherence to technology and economics that serves as a drive to competitiveness and the conquest of resources, which is often thought of as patriarchal. So interestingly, on the other side of the fence, we have the strident critics of such a position in the arguments of Jordan Peterson, born in 1962, who often rails against such views as those that feel threatened by a society, namely on the left, who are, as Peterson characterizes them, radical feminist Marxists who stand opposed to the patriarchy and thereby undermining the values and place of a masculine ethos. Yet I'm of the mind that both positions bring to attention problems that both camps tend to overlook. Right? So with ecofeminism, we see a position that is obviously critical of a push to exploit resources and also contributes to the downplaying of private life at the experience of women, namely because we in this mindset see women's roles as insignificant, and therefore women are not land owning and somehow not important. Yet, such a critique also goes hand in hand with the need to emphasize the justice and equality for all people, namely those who are overlooked, and as with women and children. So, this is obviously looking at ethics from feminist ethics with emphasis on ecofeminism, but I still think that there's enough there for just my regular ethics classes to draw conclusions as far as how it is that we're understanding feminist ethics apart from the environment. Okay, so I'll go ahead and leave you there, and we'll talk about more of the ideas soon. And thank you. Have a good day.